She loved him immeasurably, but he traded her for a more convenient heiress. Devastated and pregnant with twins, she decides to fight for her own fortune. An unexpected secret investor bets on her competence. Now, she returns even more powerful. And what happens to him? But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. April felt her phone vibrate for the third time that morning. She was standing at the far end of a glass-walled conference room in downtown Atlanta, adjusting a stack of folders on the polished table. Her nerves were already on edge, and the insistent call only added to her unease. She glanced down and saw Edward's name flashing on the screen. It still sent a pang through her, a reminder of how close they'd once been, and how abruptly things had soured. She pressed the phone to silent, refusing to let him disrupt her moment. This meeting was crucial. It was her first big contract opportunity since she'd launched her consultancy a month ago. She needed to secure it not just for her professional reputation, but also for the future of the twins she carried, a detail she'd kept private except from a few close friends. Feeling a subtle wave of nausea roll over her, she squared her shoulders and returned to the circle of chairs where 3 executives waited. They wore crisp suits and maintained polite smiles, but she sensed their skepticism. After all, who was April Adams, really? A name they'd never heard of, a face with no established track record, a woman trying to find footing in a fiercely competitive market. She reminded herself that competence speaks louder than appearances. Taking a deep breath, she launched into her presentation, voice steady and assured as she outlined her consulting approach. She made it a point to highlight her experience working in multiple sectors, sprinkling in success stories that showcased her adaptability and straightforward tactics. The executives listened, seemingly interested, though she caught hints of doubt in their expressions whenever their gazes dropped to her midsection. It wasn't obvious she was pregnant yet, but she'd begun to show a slight curve, and sometimes it drew more attention than she liked. Right as she finished summarizing her projections, her phone started buzzing again. She felt a flash of heat rise up her neck, a combination of embarrassment and frustration. This time, the men in front of her noticed the device's faint hum on the table. One of them gave a wry smile, and she tried to brush it off with an apologetic nod. She silenced the call once more, determined not to let Edward rattle her. The last thing she needed was a meltdown in front of these executives, especially when the contract was so close to being finalized. No sooner had the meeting wrapped up than April excused herself and stepped out into the hallway. The pungent smell of someone's coffee hit her stomach the wrong way, and she found herself hurrying to the restroom, pressing a hand to her mouth. Mercifully, no one else was inside. She breathed through the wave of nausea, her pulse racing as she thought of how much she was juggling: new business, pregnancy, and the heartbreak of Edward's betrayal. A faint memory flitted across her mind. Edward smiling at her in that same building months ago, wearing that trademark confidence that had once made her fall for him. With some effort, she straightened her spine and returned to the conference room, feigning composure. The lead executive had been chatting quietly with his colleagues. At her arrival, they straightened and he handed her a folder, the contract, ready to be signed, though not without some disclaimers. "We'd like to give you a chance," he said. "We think your approach is refreshing, but be aware we have high standards to maintain." April thanked them, her voice calm, even though inside her chest was bursting with relief. She swiftly signed the papers, leaving the room with her first real consulting deal in hand. A swirl of triumph coursed through her. The amount wasn't huge, but it was enough to keep her afloat, a lifeline at a critical moment. Her grin lingered until she saw the string of missed calls from Edward waiting on her screen. She didn't want to answer, but she knew ignoring him forever wasn't an option. Heart pounding, she dialed back as she hurried toward the elevators. His voice on the other end sounded as cold as the granite floors beneath her feet. "April," he said, without a greeting or hint of warmth. "I'm assuming you got my message. You have to be out of my apartment by tonight. I'm done waiting." Though she'd heard it before, the finality in his tone cut to the bone. She cleared her throat, trying to preserve an air of dignity. "I'll be out," she said, stepping into the elevator. "You don't have to remind me every 5 minutes." He snorted. "Just making sure you understand. I don't want a scene." Then the line went dead. April stood in the elevator feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She'd half hoped she could stay a few extra days, at least until she found a stable rental. But Edward was never one for generosity when it didn't serve his interests. She reached the lobby, folded the contract carefully, and told herself that tonight, no matter how painful, she would have to pack her things and go. That evening, she climbed the stairs to the apartment she'd once shared with him. Her heart felt heavy, each step recalling a memory: movie nights curled together on the couch, weekend breakfasts in the bright kitchen, the day she'd first suspected she was pregnant. Now she was alone, with only the hush of her own footsteps echoing in the hallway. Inside, most of her belongings were already boxed. She'd tried to stay ahead of Edward's threats, though she still clung to the faint hope he might have a change of heart. In the bedroom, she folded the last set of clothes into a battered suitcase, pausing to take one final look at the space where she and Edward had spent so many mornings talking about building a future together. Now that future was gone, replaced by a swirl of heartbreak, legal papers, and a near-constant taste of anxiety. A sharp knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, a tall man in a dark suit stood there, face unreadable. She recognized him from Edward's security detail. "Mr. Stone wants to be sure you're leaving tonight," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Need any help packing?" The question held a vague threat, as though he was expecting a fight. "No," April replied firmly. "I'm almost done." She brushed past him, lugging her suitcase. "There's nothing more for me here." He followed her into the hallway, looming just close enough to feel intimidating. She did her best to ignore his presence, focusing on the elevator's button. Her mind flickered with concern for the babies. A heated confrontation was the last thing she needed. In the lobby, she paused to catch her breath. The security man was still behind her, eyes watchful. Sensing her exhaustion, he took a step closer, as though to block her from turning back. "Good luck," he said flatly. She wasn't sure if it was genuine or sarcastic. For a moment, frustration flared inside her. Edward had no right to have her shadowed like a criminal. But she swallowed it down, determined not to give this man or Edward the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, she realized the night air felt colder than usual. This building, once a place of comfort, now loomed over her like a silent judge of everything she had lost. She pulled the suitcase behind her, hearing its wheels clack against the uneven pavement. A passing car splashed a puddle, narrowly missing her. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and reminded herself that, despite the heartbreak, she'd secured her first real contract today. That was the glimmer of hope she needed. She had no apartment of her own yet, no certain path to keep her business afloat. Still, something about signing that consulting deal felt like fate giving her a nod. Maybe she had to lose the familiar in order to carve out something new. Maybe she had to leave behind the ghosts of Edward's apartment to fully claim her own identity. Standing outside the apartment with a suitcase, April's phone buzzes. A mysterious email from an anonymous investor offering significant financial backing if she agrees to keep the partnership a secret. April stayed awake long after midnight, staring at the email on her phone. The mysterious investor had promised a sizable sum to help her launch her firm, so long as she kept their identity hidden. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as yet another trick or false hope. After all, her life felt like a whirlwind of uncertainty. But the bank transfer she received early the next morning confirmed it was real. It arrived without fanfare, a quiet deposit that nonetheless set her heart racing with cautious excitement. She used a portion of the funds to rent a small office in a shared corporate suite downtown. On the building's exterior, only a modest plaque featured her company name, but stepping inside the space felt like breathing in possibility. The paint on the walls was fresh, the overhead lights bright, and a second-hand desk stood in the corner, functional if not impressive. She brought in a couple of folding chairs, a worn-out sofa, and a clunky old coffee machine. It was far from luxurious, but it was hers. She spent her first afternoon settling in, unpacking files and hooking up a borrowed laptop on the desk. Every few minutes she paused to gulp down some water, fighting off the rolling waves of nausea that signaled her pregnancy in full force. The dryness in her mouth, the mild but constant fatigue, these were reminders that time was moving, that soon her twins would be part of her life in a more tangible way. She brushed her hand across her stomach, feeling a strange mix of nerves and fierce determination. There was no going back. She had to make the business take off now. In the hallway, she often glimpsed employees from other firms, consulting agencies, marketing startups, law offices, coming and going. Some offered polite nods, while others turned curious eyes on her. She tried not to read too much into their looks, but she couldn't help noticing the subtle confusion in their glances. A pregnant woman setting up a new consultancy on her own was far from typical. She braced herself, recalling the subtle prejudices she'd picked up on during her last meeting. That same afternoon, her best friend, an old college classmate she'd reconnected with, stopped by to lend a hand. They spent hours drafting emails to potential clients, scanning business directories, and setting up a bare-bones website that listed April's specialties. There was a fragile but unmistakable thrill in seeing her name and mission statement displayed publicly, as if announcing to the world that she was here to claim her space. Late in the day, her friend left to run errands, and April found herself alone, leaning back in the folding chair with a dull ache in her temples. She checked her phone for the 10th time, scanning social media for any signs of the rumors she suspected Edward might be spreading. Sure enough, she found them. Subtle jabs on industry forums claimed she was too inexperienced, relying on emotional pleas to lure clients, and playing victim to secure sympathy deals. Some posts were anonymous, others contained only partial references that still pointed unmistakably to her. A heaviness settled in her chest. She'd worked too hard to let gossip ruin her. She sent out a series of quick professional messages to potential contacts, clarifying her qualifications, emphasizing her past achievements. Then she forced herself to put the phone aside. She couldn't run after every rumor. She needed to make tangible progress that would speak louder than any falsehood Edward threw at her. The next morning brought the first sign of hope. A mid-level finance company responded to her email with interest, asking her to come in for a preliminary discussion. She pumped her fist in silent victory. If she could land this client, it would give her firm enough stability for a few months. She spent the rest of the morning preparing the pitch with as much detail and polish as possible. When she arrived at the company's reception area later that afternoon, she felt the now familiar flutter of anxiety. The building bustled with smartly dressed individuals. She spotted a group chatting near the front desk, and though their faces were polite, she sensed their silent appraisal. She'd never let it deter her before, but today her body felt more worn out than usual, and the flutter turned into a persistent worry that she wouldn't project the confidence she needed. Summoning every ounce of poise, she followed the assistant to a small conference room. The head of the finance department, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled hair, greeted her warmly and introduced two other colleagues. April launched into her pitch, conscious of the slight quiver in her voice at the outset, but determined to keep going. As she spoke, the quiver eased, and her words flowed with conviction. She outlined her unique angle, an approach that combined efficient data analysis with genuine empathy for the customer's experience. It was a fusion many firms overlooked in favor of cold metrics. One of the colleagues asked pointed questions that might have rattled her before, but she'd studied her numbers carefully. She navigated each challenge with direct answers, providing just enough detail to prove she wasn't bluffing. The tension in the room eased as they saw her confidence, and by the time they reached the final slide in her presentation, the department head nodded with a small, satisfied smile. Nothing was signed yet, but she left with a promise of a second, more formal meeting to discuss the specifics. Back at her new office, April could barely contain her excitement. It was a small step, but it reminded her that there were opportunities for someone who refused to give up. She settled into her wobbly chair with a bottle of water and let the relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she felt a tiny spark of optimism, and she allowed herself a moment to just breathe. That evening, however, the phone rang again. She recognized Edward's number and hesitated, her stomach clenching. Part of her wanted to toss the phone aside, but ignoring him might only provoke more trouble. She pressed the accept button and steeled herself for whatever he had to say. His voice came through, dismissive and sharp. "I hear you're trying to play in the big leagues now," he said. "You know it takes more than a fancy pitch deck to succeed, right?" She bristled at his condescending tone. "I'm aware," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Don't worry about me." "Too late," he snapped. "Don't say I didn't warn you when things come crashing down. By the way, I've heard your name is popping up in a few circles. People might want to know the real story." A chill trickled through her veins as she caught his implication. She pictured him spinning more rumors, planting ideas that she had stolen business strategies from him or manipulated him with her pregnancy. He thrived on controlling narratives. "Whatever you think you can do," she said. "Just remember, I'm not the same person who stayed silent before. I'm not backing down." She ended the call before he could respond, her heart pounding in her throat. The next week was an unending blur of outreach, proposals, and discreet financial planning. She used part of the anonymous investor's money to shore up her marketing materials, commissioning a straightforward but eye-catching brochure that highlighted her achievements. Word began to spread in some corners that April was tougher and more capable than Edward's rumors made her out to be. New leads trickled in at a steady pace, fueling her determination. Every time she had a pang of doubt, she remembered the feeling of signing that first contract, of stepping into that finance company's office and holding her own. But the negative whispers grew louder, too. A representative from another consultancy approached her in the elevator lobby one afternoon, wearing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hear you're in the same field," he remarked, casually adjusting the lapel of his suit. "Rumor has it you're quite persuasive." The insinuation dripped with condescension. She kept her posture straight and responded that she relied on proven methods, not sob stories. He gave a short laugh and walked away, leaving behind an air of smug doubt. A small part of her wanted to spin around and challenge him on the spot, but she forced herself to move forward, determined to let results speak for themselves. When she wasn't facing external threats, her own body reminded her that life was about to change even more drastically. Some days, her morning sickness felt unrelenting. She'd close the door to her tiny office, breathe through the discomfort, and will herself to focus on budgets and timelines. Other days, exhaustion weighed her down so heavily she had to rest her head on the desk for a few minutes. Through it all, she kept pushing, sending out proposals, scheduling meetings, and reassuring the few staffers she'd brought on board that they were building something worth believing in. At the end of another long day, she locked up the office, collecting her papers and laptop. The hallway lights were already switched off, leaving just a faint glow from the exit sign. She felt a weary satisfaction as she stepped into the elevator, thinking of how far she'd come in such a short time. She remembered the time she spent with Edward in that pristine apartment, feeling powerless and on the verge of defeat. Now she was standing on her own feet, gathering momentum. Yet there was still a chill of worry, a sense that Edward's next move might be even more destructive. She shrugged it off for the moment, telling herself she'd handle it if it came. As April left the office, she glanced at a newsstand in the lobby and froze. The magazine front page bore a photo of Edward and a tall, elegant woman flashing an enormous diamond ring. The headline hinted at the upcoming marriage of a wealthy heiress to a rising business star. There was an undercurrent of speculation that this new fiancée, with her vast family connections, was backing the rumors against Edward's competitors, likely including April. The photo alone confirmed that high society power had entered the equation, and it sent a shiver of worry through her. As she stood there in the lobby, the crisp paper in her hand, she let out a slow breath, steeling herself for what might come next. As April leaves the office, she sees a magazine headline featuring Edward's new fiancée, implying this high society heiress might be fueling the smear campaign. April lingered for a moment in the lobby, holding that magazine with the photo of Edward's new fiancée beaming from the cover. The glossy page radiated a sense of power and wealth, a stark reminder that the obstacles she faced weren't only about her ex. This woman, with all her connections, could strike at April from unexpected angles. Letting out a steadying breath, she tucked the magazine under her arm and walked outside into the late afternoon sun, her mind buzzing with concern and possibilities. Early the next morning, she arrived at the modest office she had set up with the investors' funds. The small square space she now called her headquarters felt marginally busier, especially since she had decided to use part of her resources to bring on extra hands. A few eager applicants were already lined up along the corridor, hoping to join her fledgling consultancy. Their presence was a tangible sign of growth, and she tried to keep a cool, confident aura as she greeted them one by one. In a makeshift interview corner, just a couple of chairs near the reception desk, she listened carefully to their stories. Many were young professionals hungry for a break, armed with energy and raw talent, if not vast experience. She recognized a spark of resilience in them, a determination that echoed her own. It reminded her of her younger self, stepping into the corporate world with dreams that felt just beyond reach. By midday, she'd hired 2 junior consultants and a part-time administrator to help manage the influx of small projects she was beginning to attract. The administrator, a gentle-voiced woman named Pamela, wasted no time clearing a path in the cluttered schedule. Within hours, Pamela reorganized the upcoming pitches and follow-up calls, sending out polite emails on April's behalf. April felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Finally, she wasn't fighting this uphill battle completely alone. Just after lunchtime, she gathered her tiny team in the main area of the office, balancing paper cups of sparkling juice and store-bought pastries for a small celebration. "It's not fancy," she said with a soft laugh, "but we're officially growing. Let's take a moment to acknowledge how far we've come." They clinked cups, her new hires looking both excited and slightly nervous. She could sense that they believed in her vision, even if they didn't yet know the full extent of the war she waged against rumors and hostility. When the pastries were gone and the cups discarded, she pulled up a new logo design on her laptop, unveiling what would become the visual hallmark of her consultancy. The team seemed impressed. Bright colors, bold shapes, something that conveyed forward momentum. That quiet gathering in a room still smelling of fresh paint and cheap coffee felt like the spark of a new era. The next day brought the real test. April had landed a meeting with a company that had, until recently, worked exclusively with Edward's firm. Securing just one of their smaller contracts would be a major win, a chance to prove she could compete on the same field as her ex. Her junior consultants arrived early, dressed in neat but modest business attire, anxious to show they could handle a client of this caliber. The conference room at the client's headquarters featured huge glass windows overlooking a sprawling cityscape. April took her seat across from the executives, careful not to appear too stiff. She felt the familiar swirl of nerves in her stomach, both from the pregnancy and the knowledge that Edward's name might surface at any moment. Sure enough, midway through her presentation, one executive shifted in his seat and asked, "We've been told that continuing our arrangement with Edward Stone's company is the safest bet. He has a reputation for delivering results and, well, we know his methods. How do you see yourself competing with that?" She recognized the question's subtext. How do you, an upstart, outmatch a seasoned player like Edward? But she stayed calm and thorough in her response, detailing how her approach was more adaptive and cost-efficient. She emphasized her willingness to give their project the personal attention it deserved, unburdened by the bureaucracy of a larger firm. Her new hires chimed in with data they'd meticulously prepared. Slowly, she saw the executives warm up, impressed by how quickly she and her team had assembled relevant insights. By the end, the hint of a smile flickered across their faces. They didn't promise a contract on the spot, but she left with the feeling that she'd at least given them a compelling alternative. Later that evening, after a long day of hustling between proposals, April scrolled through social media. It was impossible to avoid glimpses of Edward's fiancée. There she was, posting photos from lavish parties, sometimes throwing in casual jabs about small-time entrepreneurs who don't know their place. April's cheeks warmed with frustration, yet she told herself not to get distracted. She had actual work to do, and these posts, though petty, hinted at a deeper challenge. A wealthy, influential figure was openly mocking her, fueling the rumor mill that already labeled April as an overreaching novice. Before she could close out of the app, an alert sounded on her phone. A courier at the front desk of her building needed her signature for a letter. Puzzled, she went downstairs and found a neatly dressed man holding a large envelope. He offered no explanation, only a clipboard for her to sign. Then he disappeared into the night. Upstairs in the office, she slit the envelope open. The note inside was typed on plain paper, with no logo or signature. It delivered a blunt message. Think carefully about your condition. You shouldn't be playing in a field that will crush you. Keep going, and you risk more than your reputation. Her hand clenched the edges of the paper. There was an unmistakable threat woven through the cold language, an implication that her pregnancy made her vulnerable, that the stakes were too high for someone in her position. She sank into her chair, the overhead light casting stark shadows across the desk. Part of her wanted to lash out, to publicly call out whoever had the nerve to intimidate her. Another part of her realized that stepping boldly forward was her only option. She refused to let fear hobble her momentum. After a moment, she folded the letter neatly, locked it in a drawer, and resolved to show up twice as strong tomorrow. Determined not to let the threat slow her down, she headed to a meeting the following morning with a different prospective client. The decor in their office was minimalist, all polished metal and glass, clearly designed to project modern efficiency. She arrived early, greeting the receptionist and shaking off any lingering apprehension from the night before. The potential client turned out to be a mid-sized manufacturing firm in need of process optimization. While discussing her ideas, she saw heads nodding around the table. They seemed especially drawn to how she combined data-driven analysis with a personal touch. When the meeting wrapped up, the firm's operations director smiled and said, "We've had proposals from bigger consultancies, but I like your perspective. I think we're looking at a deal here, pending a few final checks." A surge of excitement coursed through her. Once again, she hadn't signed anything on the spot, but she felt the momentum. As she left the building, she texted her best friend, brimming with the news that they were close to landing a contract. The reply was swift but laced with caution. "That's amazing, but watch your back. I saw a guy hanging around your office again, tall, dark jacket like he was waiting for someone. Be safe." Her heart rate kicked up at the warning. She recalled how she'd sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure just beyond the glass door of her office after hours, or footsteps echoing down the corridor when no one else should be there. Perhaps it was just her imagination, fueled by nerves and pregnancy hormones, but something felt off. That evening, after the team wrapped up, she decided to do a quick check around the office. She found faint scuff marks by the door, as though someone had lingered there. Nothing conclusive, yet enough to confirm that curiosity, or outright surveillance, might be happening. It sent a chill through her, but she told herself that knowledge was power. If someone was trying to intimidate her, maybe she was making more of an impact than they expected. Her phone rang just as she was locking up. It was the investor's liaison, a calm, smooth voice that had reached out a few times before. He simply asked how things were progressing and whether she'd said anything about their involvement. She assured him she'd kept her mouth shut. grateful though she was for their financial backing. He reiterated the importance of discretion. "There are reasons for secrecy," he said, "especially with how aggressive your opposition can be." A note of caution underlined his words, but he didn't elaborate further. When the call ended, she was left with a swirl of thoughts about who this investor really was and why they had such a stake in her success. Later that night, she found herself alone in the office again, thinking about how tight her clothes were beginning to feel around her stomach. The babies were growing, and every day she had a deeper sense of responsibility. Exhaustion draped over her shoulders, yet she pushed through a few last emails, certain that the next few weeks could make or break her consultancy's chances of survival. Before heading out, she took a moment to speak with one of her junior consultants. The young man confided in her that he'd heard whispers on the job boards, claiming she was just a desperate ex-girlfriend trying to cash in on Edward's contacts. His cheeks flushed as he repeated the gossip, afraid it might offend her. Instead, she gave him a small smile of reassurance. "We'll prove them wrong by doing good work," she said. "They can talk all they want, but results don't lie." By the time she powered down her computer, the hall was quiet and dark. She shut off the lights, locked the door, and made her way home, head buzzing with everything that had happened. Despite the undercurrents of threat, her company was inching forward with new contracts and fresh talent. She clung to that growth as a lifeline, determined not to let fear poison her progress. When she finally reached her apartment, she kicked off her shoes with a weary sigh, turned on the kitchen light, and opened her laptop. The glow of the screen lit her face, and she skimmed through a stack of new emails. One, in particular, stood out, subject line in bold, "Confidential." With a mixture of curiosity and anxiety, she clicked it open. Numbers jumped out at her, a large sum, far exceeding anything she'd expected from the investor. She stared, breath catching in her throat. If this was real, it would be a colossal boost to her business, allowing her to expand faster than she'd dreamed. Late at night, April checks her email and sees an urgent message marked "Confidential." She opens it, eyes widening at the enormous transfer of funds the mysterious investor just made to her business account. A few days passed since April had discovered that surprising new deposit in her business account, and in that short time, her fledgling firm underwent a transformation that would have taken most consultancies months, if not years, to accomplish. She poured the fresh funds into hiring more talent, upgrading the modest office space, and investing in small yet impactful marketing initiatives. Word began spreading about her company's flexible, people-focused solutions, and in a competitive arena where big names tended to dominate, smaller clients found something refreshing in what April offered. The subtle disbelief in her new staff's eyes gave way to excitement as she showed them the updated balance sheet and revealed plans to expand into another suite on the same floor. Some still felt wary about the swirl of rumors and threats, but with contracts pouring in, morale rose. April found herself juggling back-to-back meetings, fielding calls from potential clients, and scheduling her growing team across overlapping projects. Despite her best efforts to conceal her fatigue, a few perceptive employees noticed the deep circles under her eyes. She chalked it up to long hours, never letting them know just how much her advanced pregnancy was sapping her strength. News of her rising success soon caught Edward's attention. She occasionally heard hushed speculation from associates within the building, whispers that Edward's firm, a once unshakable pillar in the industry, was experiencing a dip in profits. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to sting Edward's pride. He had never handled competition gracefully, especially not from someone he deemed beneath him. April figured that the best way to counter rumors was through results, so she worked tirelessly to turn every contract into a win. Her staff recorded data meticulously, optimizing processes for clients who once never thought to trust such a young consultancy. A few even praised her approach as friendly but exact, a balance often missing from larger competitors who relied on cold metrics alone. One crisp morning, she arrived at the office extra early to finalize a proposal, only to find tension already brewing. Two of her junior consultants, clearly flustered, approached her carrying a thick folder. Inside was a stack of suspicious news clippings compiled by someone who had mailed them anonymously to the office. Each clipping carried sensational headlines alleging unethical behavior on her part, baseless accusations that she bribed clients or exploited her pregnancy for sympathy. Though none of these articles cited evidence, the headlines alone were enough to catch negative attention. April swallowed hard, meeting the anxious gazes of her team. "We'll handle this," she said, voice measured. "They're just stories. Our real work speaks for itself." She asked her administrator to prepare a concise statement refuting the allegations should any client raise concerns. Yet she knew that, in a world fueled by gossip and innuendo, a mere statement might not be enough. By midday, the tension showed no sign of easing. She and a handful of her employees had been invited to a prominent corporate networking event, one known for gathering influential executives under one roof. Initially, she saw it as a golden opportunity to expand her network and showcase her growing consultancy. But with all the buzz about these negative clippings and Edward's rumored attempts to undermine her, she realized this event might become a proving ground. She arrived at the venue that evening in a simple but elegant black dress, a choice that concealed her pregnancy curve as best as possible. Her staff joined her, dressed sharply, each prepared to field questions from curious onlookers. Walking through the grand ballroom, she nodded politely at the well-dressed crowd. The low hum of conversation, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting on polished floors. This was a space meant for networking and deals sealed with handshakes. She was determined to show her mettle here. However, soon after she stepped inside, she felt the prickling awareness of being watched. In one corner stood Edward himself, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look every bit the power player. His fiancée loitered at his side, her diamond ring catching the light with every movement of her hand. Their eyes fell on April, and though Edward gave a tight-lipped smile, she sensed the animosity in his gaze. She forced herself to keep walking, head held high. April began weaving through the crowd, greeting potential clients, exchanging quick introductions. Some recognized her name, offering polite compliments on her recent contracts. A soft flutter of pride rose in her, but the hum of success was short-lived. As she finished chatting with a friendly executive, she felt a presence looming behind her. She turned to see Edward, sporting that half-smile she once found so appealing but now only found menacing. "Congratulations," he said, voice dripping with forced warmth. "I hear your business is thriving." He let the word hang in the air, as though challenging her to contradict him. She steeled herself, matching his gaze. "Yes, it is," she replied coolly. "And we're grateful for the support we've received. We plan on growing even more." His fiancée sidled closer, batting her lashes in a way that reminded April of a cat sizing up a smaller animal. "You've certainly come out of nowhere," the woman said, voice smooth. "I suppose a compelling underdog story catches people's attention." Edward leaned in slightly. "Just be careful not to overreach. People have a tendency to talk." April felt her pulse quicken but refused to let it show. "They do," she agreed lightly, "but at least now they have something good to talk about." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, a small victory in her mind. Yet she could feel Edward's furious stare following her across the room. An hour later, a hush fell as the event organizers invited key guests to address the crowd. Edward, as a major player in the industry, was given the stage. April took a sip of water, trying to quell the uneasy feeling in her chest. He spoke in carefully measured words about the state of the consulting sector, praising certain newer firms without naming names, then launched into a veiled critique of inexperienced newcomers who he claimed used unorthodox methods. She felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks but kept her composure. After the speech, April attempted to slip discreetly into a smaller side room where a few executives were mingling, hoping to secure a new contact. That was when she felt a hand clamp onto her elbow. She spun around, coming face to face with Edward again, a hardened gleam in his eyes. You think you can walk in here and just pretend you own the place? He spat under his breath, his earlier smile replaced by something uglier. I've worked for years to build my name. You're just... She cut him off. Just what? A woman? A mother-to-be? Someone you can push aside? Her voice remained hushed, but the fury in her tone was palpable. You have no right to sabotage me because you're threatened by real competition. He scoffed, stepping closer. Real competition? Don't flatter yourself. You're just making noise. And if you keep trying to steal my clients, I guarantee you'll regret it. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might physically lash out. Instead, he gripped her arm tighter, enough to make her wince. The tension between them drew the attention of nearby onlookers. A couple of security guards, alerted by their raised voices, edged closer. She yanked her arm free, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her temples. Edward's fiancée swooped in, hooking her arm through his in a show of possessiveness. April could see the mixture of arrogance and annoyance in the woman's gaze, as though April were merely an insect to be flicked away. The security guards intervened, ushering Edward back, and he allowed himself to be led off, though not before shooting April one last venomous glare. Murmurs rippled among the other attendees, all of whom had witnessed the tense exchange. Shaken, April left as soon as she could gather her composure. The memory of Edward's grip on her arm lingered like a bruise on her skin. She tried telling herself it was just a moment of anger, that he wouldn't cross a line. But doubt gnawed at her. If he was willing to cause a scene in front of corporate leaders, what else was he capable of? Later that night, she returned to her apartment, feeling drained and uneasy. She sank into her living room chair, pressing a hand to her belly in a silent promise that she would never back down from this fight. Even if every rumor swirled around her, even if Edward threatened everything she had, she owed it to the twins to stand her ground. Her phone vibrated on the table, an alert that a new message had arrived. With a tired sigh, she picked it up. The sender was a law firm she recognized as one of Edward's legal partners. As she opened the attachment, a harsh light from the screen illuminated the official wording, and her pulse began to race at the sight of the opening lines. Edward's attorneys were summoning her to court, accusing her of breach of confidentiality and threatening severe legal repercussions if she didn't comply. Just before midnight, April receives a summons. Edward is accusing her of breach of confidentiality and wants her in court. The letter warns of severe legal repercussions if she doesn't comply. April stared at the court summons spread out on her kitchen table, the crisp official letterhead seeming to mock her. The accusation, breach of confidentiality, leapt from the page, underscored with ruthless legal wording that demanded immediate compliance. She felt her stomach twist. The memory of Edward's harsh grip at the networking event still lingered on her skin, and now he'd taken their feud to an even darker level. Gone were the days of whispered threats and smear campaigns. This was a direct move designed to cripple her business and tarnish her name. She knew she needed help. Early the next morning, she called an attorney recommended by one of her newly hired consultants. The firm operated out of a tall building downtown, its reception area gleaming with polished floors and minimalist furniture. April adjusted her coat and tried to steady her breath. The weight of her pregnancy pressed down on her, a constant reminder that she couldn't give in to the stress. She had more than just her reputation to protect. She had 2 growing lives to nurture. Her new attorney, a focused woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, greeted April in a private conference room. "I've seen a lot of cases like this," she said, sliding the summons back to April. "Edward is wielding every weapon he can to corner you. We'll need to act quickly to gather evidence of your innocence." April exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and trepidation. "I'm prepared to fight," she replied, lifting her chin. "I won't give him the satisfaction of watching me crumble." Throughout that day, she met with her small legal team. They pored over old emails, contract terms from when she'd first worked alongside Edward's company, and any relevant documentation that could prove she hadn't violated confidentiality. Though they found no glaring oversights on her part, the tension hovered. Edward's lawsuit, she realized, might be more of a strategic nuisance than a genuine case, an attempt to drain her resources, tarnish her name in the industry, and distract her from the growth of her firm. Exhausted and anxious, she left the attorney's office late in the afternoon, stepping into the crisp air. As she made her way to the parking garage, her phone buzzed. She froze when she saw the incoming caller ID. It was the liaison of her anonymous investor, the man who typically shared news of large deposits and discreet support. She answered with a guarded voice, bracing herself for whatever came next. He spoke calmly, as always, but the note of urgency in his tone was palpable. "I heard about Edward's lawsuit. We've arranged for top-notch counsel to assist your legal team if necessary. Don't worry about their fees. Your backers want to ensure you get the best defense." Her jaw tightened. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "but it makes me wonder why you're this invested in helping me. Who exactly is behind the checks?" He hesitated, clearly avoiding a direct answer. "Let's just say it's someone who believes in your potential and dislikes the lengths Edward is going to undermine you. Remain discreet. Everything has a purpose." She hung up, unsettled by the cryptic kindness. On the one hand, the offer of legal assistance was a lifeline. On the other, each new display of generosity reminded her she still knew next to nothing about her biggest benefactor's true intentions. That evening, she arrived at her office to find half her staff still working, finalizing proposals and polishing presentations. A warm glow filled the space, evidence of the dedication she'd inspired in them. Pamela, her part-time administrator, hurried over with a concerned look. Edward's fiancé was on the local business news channel today. She hinted that a certain small consultancy is about to face serious legal repercussions for unethical practices. A wave of anger rolled through April. "She didn't name us, did she?" Pamela shook her head. "No, but she mentioned enough details that everyone could piece it together. She was smiling in the interview like she couldn't wait to see you fail." April forced herself to remain calm, though her temples throbbed. She turned to the rest of her team, who looked on with worried faces. "We keep pushing," she said firmly. "Rumors won't win in the face of genuine results. Show me those final proposals. Let's prove our value with real data." The staff nodded, and the hours slipped by as they worked together, ensuring every contract detail was airtight. Only when the clock neared midnight did April finally stand up, rolling her shoulders to relieve the ache. Her exhaustion was beyond physical. Mentally, she battled a swirl of fear, anger, and protective determination. She headed home, careful to lock every door. The next morning, stress pressed down like a lead weight. April struggled through her morning sickness, fighting waves of nausea that left her gasping for fresh air. More than once, she had to lay her head on her desk for a moment, waiting for the discomfort to pass. Worried staff members offered water, crackers, or simply a reassuring pat on the back. She appreciated their concern, but she hated feeling so vulnerable. A beep from her phone snapped her out of her haze. The attorney on the line asked her to come by the courthouse for a preliminary hearing. "Edward's team is pushing to expedite the process," the lawyer explained. "We need to be there to request more time to gather evidence." April agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed her coat and left the office, mindful of curious stares from her employees. In the back of her mind, she wondered if Edward or his fiancée had found a way to speed up the legal procedure, hoping to catch her off guard. Outside the courthouse, the cold marble steps loomed. She took a slow, deep breath, telling herself that she could handle this. Her attorney met her at the entrance, wearing a reassuring smile. As they walked inside, April spotted a row of imposing portraits of judges and lawmakers, each face etched with gravity. The air smelled of disinfectant and old paperwork. They entered a small chamber where Edward's legal representatives were already waiting. Her eyes swept the room, half expecting to see Edward himself. Instead, A gray-suited lawyer sat at a wooden table fiddling with a stack of documents. He barely spared April a glance, as though she were inconsequential. The judge arrived, a stern-faced woman who wasted no time calling the session to order. Edward's lawyer presented the complaint, his polished voice outlining how April supposedly violated non-disclosure agreements related to previous shared projects. April's attorney rose and carefully refuted each claim, emphasizing that no evidence of breach existed. April tried to keep her back straight, resisting the urge to shift her weight from one foot to the other, conscious of the life stirring inside her. The judge listened, quietly reviewing the documents. She turned her keen gaze on both parties. "I see no clear cause for an immediate ruling," she concluded. "I'll grant a short extension so that both sides can present further evidence. If Mr. Stone wishes to bring more specifics, he'll have to do so in a formal trial setting." A flood of relief washed over April. It was only a temporary reprieve, but it was something. Her attorney gave her a small, encouraging nod. As they exited, she braced for a confrontation in the hallway, but Edward was nowhere in sight. Only his lawyer left, stone-faced, offering no acknowledgement. Outside, the midday sun blinded her momentarily. Her lawyer departed to file some documents, leaving April to descend the courthouse steps alone. She was about to call a car when a voice called her name from behind. She turned, heart clenching at the thought it might be Edward. Instead, a familiar figure stood there, the liaison from the investor, looking oddly out of place in front of the courthouse. He took a few steps toward her, glancing around as though making sure no one overheard. "I came to see if you needed anything," he said in a low voice. "We found some documents that might help your case, but the person who's providing them wants to stay confidential for now." She narrowed her eyes. "Why the secrecy? I appreciate help, but all these hidden motives are unsettling." He offered an apologetic shrug. "Things are more complicated than you realize. There's someone else pulling the strings behind Edward. Be ready for a bigger fight." April stood on the courthouse steps, clutching her coat around her shoulders even though the day was warm. The lingering echoes of the liaison's warning buzzed in her mind. Edward might not be the only power pulling strings behind her legal troubles. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone in the crowd to be watching her, but no one seemed out of the ordinary. Still, the thought of an unknown mastermind left her uneasy. More than ever, she needed to stay focused on the case at hand. She called her best friend as soon as she reached her car. "I'm starting to believe we're only seeing half the picture," she said, voice taut with concern. "Someone else wants to destroy me just as much as Edward does, or maybe even more." Her friend's response came with a worried sigh. "We'll figure it out," she promised, "but you have to keep your guard up. Don't let the stress harm you or the babies." The next morning, April woke before dawn, her stomach twisting with intense nausea. She dragged herself to the bathroom, hands trembling as she splashed water on her face. It was a critical day in court, one where she and her team planned to present evidence suggesting that Edward had orchestrated the recent sabotage attempts, missing client files, tampered contracts, even stolen documents from her office. The knowledge that her physical condition was deteriorating weighed heavily on her. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispered a promise to the twins that she wouldn't let this break her. Despite feeling weak, she arrived at the courthouse clutching a thick folder of evidence. She tried to ignore the sideways glances from passers-by, focusing on the rhythmic click of her heels on the polished floor. Edward's lawyer was already inside, wearing a smug look that made April's pulse quicken. When the judge called the session to order, the opposing side wasted no time painting her as vindictive and unprofessional, twisting every fact into a narrative that cast doubt on her credibility. When it was her turn, April's own attorney rose, calmly presenting the first wave of tangible proof. Emails, time-stamped records, and security footage all linked Edward's associates to the disruptions that had hit April's budding consultancy. She could feel the temperature shift in the room as each new piece of evidence came to light. Edward's lawyer attempted to discredit the documents, calling them doctored or open to interpretation, but the judge seemed unconvinced by the deflections. During a short break, April retreated to a dimly lit hallway lined with austere portraits of serious-looking officials. She carefully reviewed a folder with more damning evidence, her heart pounding at how much sabotage had been orchestrated behind the scenes. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Edward's fiancée leaning against a marble pillar, arms folded and a sneer twisting her lips. The woman stared openly, as if daring April to say something. Feeling a surge of nausea rise, April turned away, not wanting to feed into the hostility. Back in the courtroom, the judge carefully studied the arguments on both sides. After a few tense minutes, she announced that final decisions would be postponed, allowing more time to fully investigate the claims. April released a shaky breath, relieved to have a chance to gather additional proof. Still, the delay meant Edward had more time to plot his next move. That very afternoon, as she sifted through her emails, an unexpected invitation caught her eye, an announcement for a shareholder meeting at Edward's company. She hadn't planned on attending, but something about the formal, almost polite wording piqued her curiosity. Attending meant walking straight into enemy territory, yet it might be her best shot at confronting him publicly. After a brief hesitation, she decided to go. On the day of the meeting, April stepped into a sleek, modern boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Rows of high-backed chairs were arranged around a glossy table where men and women in expensive suits busied themselves with last-minute notes. She recognized several of them as powerful investors who wielded significant influence in the industry. All conversation seemed to die the moment they noticed her presence. Edward, who stood near the head of the table, glanced up. His eyes narrowed into a frown. "You're not a shareholder," he said curtly, as if trying to eject her with his tone alone. Calmly, April lifted a folder brimming with records. "I'm here because every shareholder deserves to know what you've been doing behind closed doors." She let her gaze sweep the room. "They should see the truth about your sabotage and illegal attempts to destroy my consultancy. Everyone here stands to lose if this behavior continues unchecked." A hush fell over the group. Edward's face flushed with anger, but she didn't give him a chance to speak. She began laying out emails and memos that outlined how he'd used company resources to undermine her business. A ripple of shock spread through the investors. A few leaned forward, scanning the pages with disturbed expressions. One older man cleared his throat, clearly displeased by the scandal about to erupt. Edward's fiancée sat at the far side, tapping her manicured nails on the table. She stood up, voice ringing out. "This is a personal vendetta. She's twisting facts to ruin Edward's name just because he left her." She turned to the others, eyes wide with mock sincerity. "We all know she's desperate for attention." April refused to flinch. "This isn't about my personal life. It's about business ethics and the reckless choices Edward's making that put your investments at risk." The tension spiked. Edward strode across the room, closing the distance between them in a few quick steps. His voice shook with barely contained rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed, giving her folder a sharp swipe. Papers spilled to the floor, scattering evidence across the polished surface. Several shareholders recoiled while others rose from their seats. The room swirled with a sudden outcry. Before the situation could escalate further, 2 security guards hurried forward. They positioned themselves between April and Edward, preventing a physical confrontation. Edward's fiancée tried to dart in, but a guard gently held her back. She pointed an accusing finger at April. "This is all you wanted, isn't it? Some dramatic show so everyone talks about you? You've proved nothing." April gathered the scattered documents, hands shaking, but her voice managed to remain steady. "I've proved enough," she said, drawing strength from the flicker of sympathy in the eyes of a few investors. "And if you still need more, I'll bring it to court." The guards insisted Edward step aside. He glared over his shoulder, his face an unsettling mix of fury and frustration. Several of the board members began murmuring among themselves, and April could only guess how many of them would start questioning his leadership after this display. Head pounding, she slipped out of the boardroom. Her heart raced from the confrontation, but something felt different now. Perhaps a few shareholders might finally see the damage Edward was capable of. Even if they remained loyal to him for the moment, cracks had formed in his facade. As she walked toward the elevator, still shaken, she overheard a pair of hushed voices in the corridor. They were two company executives, speaking in urgent, low tones. She caught only fragments, but it was enough. One said, "The majority stake is being bought out," and the other whispered, "Yes, and it's another Stone, Edward's own brother." April slumped into the back seat of the taxi, her thoughts as jumbled as the honking traffic outside. She couldn't erase the echo of those whispers she'd overheard after the shareholder meeting. Edward's brother was quietly buying up majority shares in Edward's company. The very idea made her entire body tense with a mix of confusion and dread. She didn't know much about Edward's brother. Edward rarely talked about him, but from the few comments he had ever made, there was obvious bad blood between them. If he was the same secret investor who'd been pouring money into her venture, then she'd unknowingly been taking funds from another branch of the Stone family all along. The moment she arrived at her apartment, she kicked off her shoes and slumped into the old armchair by the window, letting the stress of the day settle over her. The twins in her belly stirred as if sensing her turmoil. She placed a comforting hand on the small curve that had grown more prominent in recent weeks. "We'll be okay," she murmured softly, hoping the words would soothe not just the unborn babies but also her own jagged nerves. She tried to settle into some semblance of routine that evening, heating leftover soup and forcing herself to eat. The television hummed in the background, broadcasting a finance news segment that of course featured a brief mention of Edward Stone's recent board upheavals. She flicked the TV off, unable to bear the coverage. Instead, she reached for her phone, scrolled through incoming client emails, and tried to focus on something productive. Yet her concentration shattered each time she wondered about the identity of her mysterious investor. Every clue pointed to Edward's brother. Had she been unknowingly further entangling herself with the Stone family, the same family that had cast her out so coldly? A gentle buzz on her phone signaled a late text from her best friend, who urged her not to give up, reminding her she had built something impressive and no matter who was pulling the strings, she deserved her success. April managed a faint smile at that support, though it did little to ease the swirl of unease in her gut. She thought about how quickly her fortunes had changed since those large sums started appearing in her account. Without them, she might have shut down her consultancy months ago. Yet it all felt tainted now, as though a trap had been laid and she'd walked right into it. The next day, April woke feeling heavier than usual, her ankles swollen and her head pounding from lack of restful sleep. She dressed carefully, choosing a loose-fitting outfit that accommodated her growing belly and made it easier to breathe. Even tasks like tying her shoes seemed to take extra effort. She glanced at herself in the mirror, noticing the tension etched around her eyes. Though she had no court hearings scheduled that day, she was due at her office to meet clients and reassure her staff that everything was still under control. When she arrived at the office, she found her small team buzzing with talk about the rumors swirling through the industry. Pamela, the kind administrator who'd become one of April's biggest supporters, waved her over with a troubled expression. "There's been a series of calls," Pamela said quietly. "Potential clients asking if you're really working with someone from the Stone family. They're worried about conflicts of interest." The words sank like a stone in April's chest. "And how did you respond?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I told them I'm not aware of any direct Stone involvement," Pamela replied, "but you might need to address this head-on soon." April nodded, feeling a wave of fatigue wash over her. She knew that if she publicly denied ties to Edward's brother and was later proven wrong, it would destroy any credibility she had left. Yet confirming it now, without understanding his true motives, felt reckless. She spent the rest of the morning juggling phone calls, trying to keep existing contracts from slipping away. Distraction gnawed at her, making it hard to hold coherent conversations about project timelines or deliverables. Each time she put the phone down, she thought of the stone name and how it loomed over every move she made. By midday, she felt so drained that she decided to step outside for fresh air. In the building's lobby, she spotted a tall figure leaning against the wall by the elevators. He wore a simple suit and held a smartphone in one hand. Something about him felt vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. When he looked up and caught her eye, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He quickly turned, striding out through the glass doors onto the busy street. A small chill rippled through her. Paranoia? Or was someone truly watching her? She headed to a nearby cafe, determined to calm her mind. The smell of roasted coffee beans was comforting, a small break from the mounting chaos. She ordered a herbal tea, hoping it might settle her nerves, and sank into a corner seat where she could watch passers-by out the window. In the muted chatter of the cafe, she allowed herself a moment to rub her belly gently and acknowledge her exhaustion. The twins' presence felt like the only grounding force in her life right now. After a few minutes, she checked her phone and found multiple unread messages from clients, colleagues, and her lawyer. One message, though, stood out. It was from the liaison of the anonymous investor, asking if she was free to meet. Her heart pounded. This could be the moment she'd either confirm or dismiss the idea that her benefactor was, in fact, Edward's brother. She typed a short reply, "Yes, I can meet this afternoon," then finished her tea, trying to steel herself for whatever revelations lay ahead. Returning to the office, April went straight to the small conference room, instructing Pamela to usher in the liaison as soon as he arrived. She paced around the table, straightening stray papers, almost laughing at herself for tidying up as though that might soothe her nerves. When he finally appeared, she noticed a faint tension in his brow, like even he was anticipating conflict. They greeted each other politely. He sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "Thank you for making time," he began, his tone careful. "Just tell me," she said, exhaling. "Is my investor Edward's brother?" He hesitated a moment, then nodded. "Yes. He's been aware of your situation for quite a while. I believe he wanted to help because he felt you were wronged. And he has his own issues with Edward. This was a chance to stand against him by assisting you." She felt heat flood her cheeks. The confirmation was overwhelming, like stepping onto a rug that was suddenly yanked out from beneath her feet. Part of her had expected it, but hearing it aloud made it painfully real. "So I've just been a piece in a power struggle between two brothers?" "No," he said quickly. "It's not that simple. He respects you, your potential. He's truly been impressed by how you've built your company from the ground up." She stood up, arms folded over her chest. "I'm pregnant with Edward's children," she snapped, voice trembling. "He threw me out, tried to ruin me, and now his brother swoops in to fund my entire operation? How can I trust any of this?" The liaison's expression softened. "I understand why you'd be skeptical, but you should know that this was never meant to be a game at your expense. If anything, his goal was to help you reclaim what Edward took from you, both your dignity and your place in the business world." Her eyes stung. She glanced at her reflection in the conference room's glass walls, noticing how weary she looked. "What do I do now?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "My success, my progress, was any of it truly mine, or was it always under his influence?" He didn't have an easy answer. "All I can say is that I've seen the effort you put in, the long hours, the battles you've fought in court and out. That can't be faked. If you decide to cut ties, that's your choice, but please don't doubt your own achievements." In the silence that followed, she wondered if her story would ever be free of the stone name. She felt trapped, haunted by Edward's rage on one side and uncertain about the brother's motives on the other. Exhaustion crashed over her again, deeper this time, drawing out the first tears she'd allowed herself in a while. She sank slowly back into her chair, shoulders sagging. The liaison rose quietly, offering her a business card. "If you ever want to speak with him directly, let me know. There are some important documents he wants to share with you. It may help clarify everything." She couldn't muster the energy to respond. He left without another word, leaving her in a still, charged atmosphere. At the thought of confronting Edward's brother, her stomach lurched, and she could feel her heart pound beneath her ribs. Part of her wanted to meet him, demand answers to every question raging in her head. Another part, though, was terrified she'd find herself in yet another manipulative web. That evening, she dragged herself home to her cramped apartment, belly heavy, heart heavier still. She dropped onto the couch, cradling her stomach and letting tears slip down her cheeks. The twins moved gently, a soft reminder that she had more to worry about than just herself. As her phone buzzed, she retrieved it from her bag and noticed a new message from the liaison containing only a curt line, "He's ready whenever you are." April stared at her phone, torn between ignoring the summons or finally facing the mysterious brother who held her company and her future in his hands. April paced the length of her tiny living room, the curtains drawn to keep out the midday glare. She'd agreed, at last, to meet Edward's brother. The liaison had given her an address, a discreet office suite on the far side of town, where the older brother supposedly kept a small base of operations. Every nerve in her body buzzed with apprehension. Was she truly about to sit face to face with someone carrying the same last name as the man who'd done so much to hurt her? She tried to calm her racing thoughts by gulping down a glass of water, but the restlessness lingered. Her hands shook as she gathered documents and notes, though she wasn't sure she'd even need them. This meeting might be about pure truth, questions she had no easy way of asking, answers she might be afraid to receive. With a final look in the mirror, she noticed the fatigue etched around her eyes, the faint circles that betrayed sleepless nights. She steadied herself, grabbed her coat, and headed out. The drive took her through winding streets lined with tall, modern buildings whose mirrored facades glinted in the midday sun. As her car approached the location, she realized it was a modest structure, tucked behind a row of upscale boutiques. The doorman in the lobby offered her a warm smile, tipping his hat politely, but she still felt her heart hammering against her ribcage. A quiet elevator ride brought her to the 6th floor. She followed the gold lettering on a frosted glass door, "Stone and Associates, Private Suite." It figured that Edward's brother would carry the same last name in some form. She inhaled, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The waiting area surprised her. Instead of a grand reception desk and bustling assistants, she found a small, tastefully decorated room with a single couch and a side table boasting an elegant flower arrangement. Seated on a chair near the far wall was the liaison, his hands folded over a slim folder. He stood immediately when he saw her, giving a half nod. "He's ready for you," he said softly, gesturing toward a closed door. "But if at any point you feel uncomfortable, just let me know." April gave a brief nod. She couldn't muster a smile. "Thank you." She crossed the waiting area, her footsteps hushed on the plush carpet. When she opened the door, she stepped into a minimalistic office bathed in soft light. Behind a sleek, dark wood desk stood a tall man with sharp features and eyes that hinted at a family resemblance to Edward. Yet there was a warmth in his expression, tempered by nerves, as though he too was unsure how this meeting would unfold. "April," he said gently, rounding the desk to greet her. "I'm Gabriel Stone. Thank you for coming." She took in a breath, noticing how her heart thudded at the mention of that last name, Stone. "I almost didn't," she admitted, forcing herself to stand tall despite the weight of her belly. "But I've learned enough to figure out you're the one who's been investing in my company, supporting my legal fights. I need to know why." He nodded and waved a hand toward a pair of chairs near the window. "Please sit. I'll explain everything." She settled onto a chair, resting a hand over the gentle curve of her stomach. He took the seat opposite, crossing his legs and leaning forward. For a moment, neither spoke. She used the silence to study him. Older than Edward by a few years, she guessed, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes. Something in his gaze spoke of regret, though she couldn't pinpoint its cause. "At first," Gabriel began quietly, "I wanted to help you because I saw how unfairly Edward treated you. When I realized you were struggling to get your consulting business off the ground, I decided to step in. Maybe that's me overstepping," he added with a rueful tilt of his mouth. "But watching him attempt to ruin you, it felt wrong." April folded her arms, uncertain. "You're his brother. Why turn on him like this?" His brow furrowed. "We have a difficult history. Edward and I never agreed on the direction of our family business. We fought for years until I walked away. My share of the family fortune allowed me to invest in opportunities of my own. When I saw him sabotaging you, throwing you out while you're pregnant, launching legal attacks, I couldn't stand by." He rubbed his chin, troubled. "I wanted to do something. Helping you also felt like a chance to show him that his cruelty would have consequences." She let those words settle. A swirling mixture of relief and wariness coursed through her. "So you admit that it isn't entirely about me. It's partly about getting back at Edward." A faint color rose in his cheeks. "I won't lie. It began that way. But as I watched you persevere, I grew to respect you a lot. You kept pushing forward, even when every door was slammed in your face. You had a focus I've rarely seen. So yes, it started as a way to undermine Edward's attempts to control everything, but it became more. I realized I wanted to see you succeed for your own sake, not just to spite him." She clasped her hands in her lap, her gaze drifting momentarily to the window, where the sun cast a dappled glow across the floor. "It's hard for me to trust anything connected to the Stone name," she admitted softly, turning back to him. "I nearly lost everything because of your brother." He reached for a small folder on the side table. "I expected that, which is why I want to be transparent with you." Carefully, he opened the folder, revealing several documents. "These are the legal papers detailing my share acquisitions in Edward's company, and how I've shifted certain voting rights. If you wish, you have enough standing to claim majority control if you partner with me. You would be able to remove Edward from power entirely." Her throat felt tight. She blinked, scanning the lines on the pages. A part of her was tempted by the sheer poetic justice of it, the chance to strip Edward of his empire the way he'd tried to strip her of her future. But the idea of relying on Gabriel to do it sent a shiver of doubt through her. She looked up, confusion lacing her voice. "Why would you hand me that kind of power?" His eyes softened. "Because I believe you'll use it responsibly, and because Edward's role as CEO is tainted by the lengths he's gone to against you. He's jeopardizing investor trust. This is the best way to hold him accountable." Emotion churned in her chest, anger, hope, fear, all swirling. She tried to imagine the future if she took control of Edward's firm. Would it be revenge or a chance at something better for her twins? Sighing, she closed the folder gently. "I'm not sure," she whispered. "A few months ago, I couldn't even find my footing. Now you're offering me the reins to everything Edward built. It feels like I'm in the middle of a family chess game." Gabriel reached out cautiously, placing his hand over hers where it lay on the folder. His touch was light, respectful. "I know it's a lot, but please understand, this is your decision. I won't force your hand. If you choose to walk away, I'll respect that. But if you want to protect your business, your reputation, maybe even find justice for how Edward wronged you, this is a real path forward." She swallowed, nodding slowly. Beneath the tension, there was a stir of unexpected warmth. For a moment, she wondered if this man truly admired her, if his sympathy was more personal than he dared admit. That flicker of possibility made her heartbeat flutter, though she quickly reminded herself of the heartbreak Edward had caused. Caution was essential. Still, she couldn't deny that Gabriel seemed sincere. His presence lacked Edward's arrogance, his voice steady and unthreatening. In another life, she might have let herself trust him without so much hesitation. But for now, all she could manage was a quiet, "I'll think about it." Before the silence grew awkward, Gabriel stepped back, releasing her hand. "I'd expect nothing less. Take the folder. Review everything with your attorney. I'm open to any questions you have. And if you decide to keep fighting, I'll stand by you." She hesitated, then rose to her feet, clutching the documents. "Thank you. I appreciate your honesty." He escorted her to the door, the corridor's lights catching the faint lines of tension in his features. "If you need anything, personal or business, reach out. Truly." She nodded, stepping back into the waiting area, feeling as though she'd just woken from a dream where everything was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. The liaison offered her a polite farewell, and before she knew it, she was in the elevator descending to the ground floor. On the street, the bustle of city life momentarily grounded her. Delivery trucks rumbled by, pedestrians hurried across crosswalks, and a cool breeze tugged at her jacket. She felt the documents' weight in her arms. Inside them lay the potential to shake Edward's entire empire. Yet the path ahead remained shadowed by uncertainty. For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. In her office, she tried to review proposals but found herself reading the same line again and again. A few times, she caught herself daydreaming about what it would look like to stand in a boardroom, announcing she was the new controlling partner, and to see Edward's face twisted in disbelief. But each imagining carried its own baggage. She was exhausted, in the thick of a difficult pregnancy, and the idea of stepping into a corporate war unnerved her. Evening approached, and she decided to head home early, ignoring the stack of tasks that still needed her attention. The swirling tangle of her thoughts demanded rest she was too frazzled to find at the office. Stepping onto the bus, her car was in for repairs. She slid into a seat by the window. The city lights danced across her reflection, and in that faint glow, she saw her tired eyes drifting shut. When she arrived at her apartment, she let herself sink onto the couch without even turning on the lights. Her breathing steadied, and she half-dozed, replaying Gabriel's words in her head. She wondered who he was behind the calm facade, what stories he could tell about Edward, and how he truly viewed her beyond being a means to an end. The buzz of her phone cut through the haze. She reached for it, blinking groggily at the bright screen. The caller was one of her senior employees, sounding panicked. "April, there's a problem at the office. Someone broke in tonight." Her heart lurched. "What? Is everyone safe?" "We're all fine, but we think they took sensitive documents. You need to get down here." Late that night, April's phone buzzes with an emergency alert from her office. A break-in has occurred, and someone stole sensitive documents, possibly implicating Edward or his brother. April arrived at her office to find the front door propped open, the lock visibly damaged. Night's darkness pressed in on the corridor, broken only by the glare of the overhead lights inside her small reception area. Two police officers stood near a toppled file cabinet, scribbling notes while a couple of her staff hovered by the windows. The air smelled faintly of dust and tension. Just stepping inside made her heart pound, and it wasn't just from her advancing pregnancy. Pamela, her ever-dedicated administrator, rushed forward with wide eyes. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, voice trembling. "We discovered the break-in less than an hour ago. The alarm system was disabled somehow." April placed a hand on her abdomen as if to steady the swirling fear. "Is everyone safe?" Pamela nodded. "We were all gone when it happened. But—" She trailed off, glancing toward the back office. "It looks like they took specific documents, not just random stuff." April exchanged a look with one of the officers, who gave her a sympathetic nod before turning his attention back to his notepad. She walked carefully across the strewn papers on the floor. The place had been ransacked with purpose. Desk drawers yanked open, folders scattered, but only some items missing. She recognized client proposals, vendor contracts, and older files from when she first set up the consultancy. Also gone were any references to her ongoing legal battle with Edward. Notes, memos, all vanished. She stiffened. They knew what they were looking for. One of her junior consultants stood behind her. We had everything locked up, but they went right for the more sensitive drawers. They must have known the layout. April thought of Edward or his fiancée, perhaps paying someone off to invade her workspace. Yet a flicker of doubt nagged at her mind. Maybe there was more to this than petty sabotage. She recalled the safe deposit box key in her purse. The documents inside that box were even more incriminating, and no one had touched that. Could this break-in be a desperate attempt to piece together the final puzzle in Edward's downfall? Or was it meant to spook her into giving up? Her phone vibrated at that moment. She pulled it out, half expecting a message from the mysterious liaison or Gabriel Stone himself. Instead, the caller ID showed an unknown number. With a curt apology to the police, she stepped into a corner to take the call. A raspy voice spoke quietly, so low she had to press the phone closer. "Did you get my note?" it asked. "I left something behind." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You should check the bottom drawer of your old desk," the voice continued, ignoring her question. Then the line went dead. Unease pricked along her spine. She pocketed the phone and moved briskly toward the desk she'd used before upgrading to a larger office room. The police had checked it, but maybe they missed something subtle. She crouched beside the half-splintered drawer and eased it open, rummaging through the leftover stationery and worn-out folders. After a few seconds, she found a sealed envelope tucked beneath a bundle of blank forms. Scrawled on its surface was her name, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "You're running out of time. If you want your truth to matter, find what they're hiding. No signature, no clear directions." Frustrated, she stuffed the note into her pocket. Another cryptic threat. Was it from the same party who orchestrated the break-in, or from someone trying to help her? The entire situation felt like a labyrinth of half-truths and hidden motives. All she knew for sure was that crucial paperwork about her case and her deals had vanished, stolen by someone who either wanted to bury the evidence or expose it in a controlled way. Pamela rejoined her, eyes filled with sympathy and fear. "What do we do now?" April rubbed her temple, wincing at the headache blossoming behind her eyes. "We'll secure whatever files we have left and make digital backups. Tomorrow morning we'll bring in a professional security firm to upgrade our systems. We can't afford another breach." She glanced at the police officers speaking to the junior consultants. "I'll also push them to investigate thoroughly, though I doubt we'll find immediate answers." Pamela helped her gather some of the scattered papers, stacking them carefully on the nearest desk. In the soft overhead light, April noticed the exhaustion etched on her friend's face, and wondered if her own looked just as worn. The weight of the twins pressed harder on her frame. She felt a surge of protectiveness for those two little lives, unasked participants in this battle. By the time the police finished their preliminary inquiries, it was past midnight. April locked up the office as best she could, then stepped outside into the chilly air. She spotted a tall figure lurking near the edge of the parking lot, bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp. Her pulse jumped. She half expected Edward or one of his henchmen. Taking a sharp breath, she approached. But as she drew closer, she recognized Gabriel Stone. He stood there, shoulders tense, hands in his pockets. The moment he saw her, he moved forward, concern etched into his features. "I heard," he said in a low tone, eyes flicking toward the shattered lock on the door behind her. "I tried calling you, but your line was busy." She nodded, still feeling the jittery rush of nerves. They made quite a mess, stole critical documents. The breeze cut between them and she tugged her coat tighter. "Why are you here?" His expression softened with empathy. "After we talked earlier, I was worried Edward might try something rash if he suspected you had more evidence. I wanted to make sure you were safe." The mention of Edward made her blood boil. "I can't say I'm safe. This break-in just turned my office inside out, and I have no idea who's behind it." Even as she spoke, her mind reeled with the possibility that Gabriel himself could be orchestrating events. But his concern looked genuine, and the memory of their earlier conversation quelled her suspicions, at least for now. He lowered his gaze, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. "I'm sorry. You wouldn't be in this position if it weren't for my brother. If there's anything I can do—" She folded her arms, letting out a long breath. "I need to figure out who took these files and why, and I need to protect whatever evidence remains that could prove Edward's wrongdoing. Time is running out. The trial can't be postponed much longer." She felt a slight throb in her abdomen, a reminder that she wasn't just battling for her business, but also carrying two growing lives. "I'm nearing my due date, and I can't put off the legal showdown forever." Gabriel reached out, pausing just short of touching her arm, as though uncertain whether the gesture would be welcome. "Let me help you. I can hire private investigators, do whatever it takes to find out who broke in, and those documents in your safe deposit box. Maybe they're key to all this." She nodded, though apprehension still gnawed at her. "We'll talk tomorrow," she said. "For now, I need to go home and rest." She glanced back at the building, feeling a pang of loss for the sense of security she once had in her own workspace. He inclined his head in understanding. "Take care of yourself. Let me know if anything else happens." She thanked him, though a flicker of uncertainty lingered in her chest. As she climbed into her car, she couldn't help wondering if she was walking a tightrope between trusting Gabriel and risking even greater betrayal. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, and she fought to keep her eyes open on the drive back. The city lights blurred, her mind drifting to the stolen files and the cryptic note left in her desk drawer. When she finally stumbled into her apartment, the rooms felt colder and emptier than usual. Everything ached, her feet, her back, her head. She settled onto the couch, pressing a hand to her belly and murmuring reassuring words to the twins. She reminded herself that she had to keep fighting, to stay strong enough for them. The break-in was just one more obstacle. She would find a way around it. Early the next morning, she returned to the office with a new security team in tow. They installed upgraded locks, cameras, and an alarm system sophisticated enough to discourage any further intrusions. Her staff arrived, bleary-eyed, each ready to salvage whatever they could from the chaotic mess. While they worked, April retreated to a smaller conference room to make frantic calls to current clients. She assured them everything was under control, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She heard the tremble in her words. As the day wore on, she noticed some employees shooting her worried glances. Word about the break-in had spread, and a few of them whispered their concerns about whether staying on at her firm might damage their careers if Edward really was behind the sabotage. She understood their fear, yet it pained her to see doubt creeping through the one place she'd tried so hard to keep stable. By mid-afternoon, a wave of nausea hit her so suddenly that she had to excuse herself from a conversation with one of her junior consultants. She rushed to the restroom, gripping the sink to steady herself. The stress, combined with her advanced pregnancy, was taking a toll. She recalled the doctor's earlier warnings about potential complications if she pushed herself too hard. Once she collected her composure, she made it back to her desk, where her phone immediately buzzed with another call from her legal advisor. April's heart sank as she listened to the attorney confirm that the final court date was set, and Edward had declined any extension. She had less than 48 hours before she would face him in court to resolve the breach of contract accusations, and now she had missing evidence to track down. Her entire body felt on the brink of collapse. That night, she collapsed into bed, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures rifling through her files, of Edward laughing while a gavel pounded in the background. Sometime after midnight, she startled awake with a sharp pain in her abdomen. For a panicked moment, she worried she might be going into labor. She'd never felt anything quite like it before. By morning, the pain subsided into an aching throb. Still, she couldn't risk another meltdown. She decided to check into the hospital just to be sure everything was all right with the twins. The bright, sterile corridors made her heart race with anxiety, but a calm nurse led her to a private room. They strapped monitors around her belly, checking the baby's heart rates and her own vitals. April lay back on the exam table, breath shallow, as the nurse offered a gentle smile. "We'll keep you a little while for observation just to make sure everything's stable." Outside, the sun rose higher, and she knew the clock was ticking toward her court date. She was needed to finalize preparations, to protect her business, to prove Edward's sabotage in front of a judge. Yet she was here, strapped to wires and monitors, fear swirling in the pit of her stomach. As she gazed at the machines that monitored her contractions, a cold sweat broke over her skin. Strapped to a hospital bed, April senses contractions beginning, yet she's needed in court in less than 48 hours. The tension is nearly unbearable. April closed her eyes, letting the hum of the hospital's monitors lull her into a shaky calm. She had spent the better part of the night strapped to wires that tracked her contractions and the twins' heart rates. Outside, dawn broke in a wash of pale light, and a tired nurse stepped in to check on her. Each beep and soft hiss reminded her that time was running out. Court was in less than 2 days, and she was nowhere near ready. She swallowed her dread. The babies came first, no matter what. Sometime after sunrise, a gentle knock sounded at the door. She expected another nurse, perhaps a doctor. Instead, Gabriel stood there, hair slightly mussed, a mix of concern and relief clouding his features. He looked oddly out of place in the drab hospital hallway. Clutching a bouquet of white roses, he entered quietly. "How did you know I was here?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with surprise. He gave a faint, apologetic shrug. "Your best friend called me when she couldn't reach you. I came as fast as I could." April eyed him warily, unsure how to respond. Part of her was grateful for the support, but another part still wrestled with caution. He was Edward's brother, after all. Yet seeing the genuine worry in his eyes eased some of her tension. He asked how she was doing, and she admitted the contractions had calmed somewhat, but the doctors were still concerned about premature labor. Gabriel hesitated, setting the roses on a side table. "You shouldn't be alone," he said quietly, "especially when you're dealing with so much." She felt tears threaten. Exhaustion weighed her down, and the stress of the looming court date loomed even heavier. A nurse breezed in to check her vitals and, noticing Gabriel's presence, smiled discreetly before slipping out. April let out a slow breath. "I appreciate you coming," she managed, rubbing her belly in a restless gesture. "But I don't know how to handle everything right now. The break-in, the missing documents, Edward's lawsuit, and now this." Gabriel's gaze lingered on her face. "Let me help. I can talk to your lawyers, arrange any missing evidence we need. I can gather my own investigators. There's still time, even if we're cutting it close." Time. The word echoed in her head. If these babies decided to come early, she might miss the court hearing entirely. And if she missed the hearing, Edward would almost certainly be handed a victory by default. She thought of all the effort she'd poured into her business, how close she was to exposing his sabotage, how desperately she needed to protect her children's future. Could she really trust Gabriel to fight in her name without using her as a pawn? She wasn't sure, but lying in that hospital bed, she didn't see any other options. "All right," she said, voice trembling. "I'll give you access to everything we have left. Work with my legal team. Do whatever it takes." A flicker of relief crossed his features. He leaned forward, speaking low. "Thank you for trusting me." Over the next few hours, nurses bustled around April, adjusting monitors, asking about her pain level. The contractions slowed, then stopped, though her body still ached with tension. Her doctor eventually arrived, scanning her chart with practiced calm. "We're going to keep you overnight," she announced. "You need rest. You're under a lot of stress, and that can speed up labor." April tried to protest, pointing out her urgent business in court, but the doctor's firm tone left no room for argument. "Your babies are only so resilient," the doctor said gently. "Give them at least a day of calm, or you risk more complications. If everything looks stable tomorrow, we'll release you." She nodded, heart pounding. One day. That left her with only a handful of hours before she was due in court. Yet she couldn't allow Edward to believe she'd been forced to back down. Gabriel assured her he'd coordinate with her attorney and do damage control for the next 24 hours. Reluctantly, she surrendered to the hospital's care. That night she dozed in and out of a restless sleep, startled awake by occasional twinges in her belly. Each time she blinked into the dim lamplight, she expected to see Edward sneer or his fiancée's mocking eyes. Instead, she found a nurse, or sometimes Gabriel, who remained steadfast, seated in a chair with one leg crossed over the other, laptop open to emails and documents. Each time April asked him to go home and sleep, he'd shake his head. "I'll stay," he insisted. "I don't mind." By morning, the doctor returned with cautiously good news. Her condition had stabilized enough for discharge, provided she took it easy. April breathed a sigh of relief. The moment they removed the monitors, she got dressed with care, wincing at the ache in her lower back. Gabriel stepped out to let her maintain some privacy, then returned with a gentle knock. "Ready?" he asked, offering a tentative smile. "We can head straight to your office. I have updates from your lawyer. The hearing's tomorrow morning, no chance of a delay. We've gathered evidence from your backups and from certain documents I've been keeping. It looks promising." Though her body protested, she felt a surge of determination. "Let's go," she said, grabbing her coat. "I'm not letting Edward walk all over me just because I had to spend a night in the hospital." The day passed in a whirl of final preparations. At her office, she found an air of tension mingled with hope. Her team was on edge, sifting through every piece of digital backup they could salvage. A few employees quietly thanked her for not giving up, despite the chaos. She tried to keep a brave face, ignoring the lingering cramps that made her pause every now and then. Gabriel coordinated long conference calls with the legal team, clarifying how to present the tampering evidence and show the judge how Edward targeted April's company. April forced herself to stay calm, stepping in only when necessary to confirm details. Each time she felt stress build, she took a short break to breathe deeply, reminding herself the babies needed her steady, not frantic. At long last, the final day arrived. April stood at the courthouse steps, the morning sun illuminating her face. She wore a simple but professional dress that accommodated her pregnancy, trying to exude confidence even though her heart thundered like a drum. Gabriel offered a supportive nod. Her attorney clutched a binder stuffed with carefully labeled tabs. Inside, the courtroom bustled with tension. Edward sat at one table in a crisp suit, his expression schooled into detached smugness. His fiancée perched beside him, looking bored and smug in equal measure. April's attorney guided her to the opposite table. She glanced around, catching glimpses of a few curious spectators and journalists. Today, everything would be decided. The judge entered, calling for silence. Arguments began immediately. Edward's lawyer attempted to paint April as an opportunist, claiming she had no real evidence. But her attorney responded with a neatly organized avalanche of proof. Timestamps showing Edward's employees accessing her systems, emails mentioning the ex who needs to be shut down, and recorded phone logs tying back to Edward's staff. Each new piece of evidence rang out like a hammer strike. At one point, Edward's lawyer tried to interrupt, insisting the evidence was forged. Calmly, Gabriel stepped forward, explaining that he had verified the documents with independent investigators. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom as he stated his position clearly. He was Edward's brother. yet he was there to confirm the authenticity of April's claims. Edward's face grew pale, his facade cracking. This was more than he'd expected. As midday approached, both sides gave their final statements. April felt her breath catch in her throat, exhaustion creeping in. She placed a hand protectively over her belly. The judge observed her carefully, and for a moment, April thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in the woman's stern gaze. Then the judge spoke. In light of the evidence provided by Ms. April Adams and her counsel, and verified by an independent source intimately familiar with Mr. Edward Stone's operations, I find Mr. Stone's lawsuit without merit. Furthermore, this court recognizes significant signs of sabotage on Mr. Stone's part. I encourage Ms. Adams to file a countersuit, should she wish to pursue damages. A hush fell. Edward sank into his chair, jaw tight with shock. His fiancée looked horrified. April's heart soared with relief so profound she felt tears sting her eyes. The judge's gavel struck with finality, and the courtroom emptied. In the corridor outside, her staff embraced one another, while reporters snapped pictures shouting questions. Edward lingered near the exit, face twisted in fury, as if still struggling to comprehend how everything had crumbled around him. Over the next few days, the corporate world buzzed with the news. Edward was removed from his CEO position as shareholders, now aware of his unethical actions, refused to stand by him. Contracts flooded April's consultancy, and she realized she had the option, through Gabriel's arrangement, to step into majority ownership of Edward's old company, a symbolic victory she had never imagined possible. Shortly after the court's decision, she gave birth. The labor came a few weeks earlier than expected, but the twins arrived safely, two tiny lives pulsing with possibility. The hospital stay this time felt triumphant rather than terrifying. Flowers and congratulations poured in, even from former skeptics. Gabriel visited daily, his gratitude evident as he murmured encouraging words and hovered anxiously, demonstrating a caring warmth she had hardly dared to hope for. When at last she was discharged, April embraced the next chapter of her life. She found herself in a gleaming executive office, the one that had once been Edward's domain, now scrubbed of his influence. She hung simple frames on the wall, each showcasing awards and personal photos, reminders of her journey from rejection to redemption. The twins slept in a nursery just down the hall, cared for by a trusted nanny whenever April found herself pulled into meetings or calls. And there, in that office, as she prepared for a day of leading the combined forces of her old firm and Edward's restructured company, April took a moment to savor the quiet before the world demanded her attention. In her new executive office, April gazes at photos of her sleeping twins. Her gaze then meets that of Edward's brother, who stands by her desk. She feels a sense of completion and possibility, murmuring, "It took losing everything to realize I deserve better. And so do my babies." Then she smiles, ready to lead both her family and her newly acquired empire into a brighter future. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen